Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is Christopher Donald, and I'm going to be doing a demo today on trimming and throwing feet onto the bottoms of plates. First off, one little trick that I have to use here is I don't have bat pin holes in the head of my wheel. So if I want to use a bat, which I have to because the rim of my plate is bigger than the diameter of my wheel head, I'm going to put down a 1/4 inch clay coil and then flatten this down, and then this is what I'm going to stick my bat to. This would not be strong enough for actually throwing, not at least large pieces of clay. The wheel wedging process would probably pull this off of the wheel head. But if I used a plaster bat, this would be strong enough. And I'll do a video at some point on how you use plaster bats. It's actually what we used when I worked in production. You can just have a thin disc of plaster. You wet the coil, you wet the plaster, you put it on, and it sticks down. So it's not going to go anywhere. This is just a plastic PVC disc, and so this isn't going to stick quite as firmly as that. I'm going to go ahead and turn my wheel on, and then before I bump this fully into place, I'm going to get it turning, and I'm just going to tap center it as if I was trimming something. There we go. So it's tap centered, and then I can go around and evenly put pressure on it to get it stuck down to that coil of clay. That's more than enough, especially for trimming. The other things I'm going to get ready here is I'm going to put my pan back on. This was large enough that it would have been hard for me to tap center it with the pan in place. Oh, I'll grab the other half of it. There we go. Catch some of the shavings, hopefully. That is a tight fit. That is 1/16 of an inch away from the pan, so well done me. All right, so I threw a couple of plates for an earlier demo, and I'm going to take one of these, which was thrown in kind of a traditional way from one lump of clay, and I'm going to flip it upside down. It's stiff enough now that it can support itself, and I'm going to tap center this onto the bat. So I get the wheel turning a little bit, and then just keep my hands spread out nice and wide around the base, and I can just tap it until it's centered. Things that are this broad, this wide, I seldom need to do more than just use a, a juice cap to hold it on. Generally, I don't need to put a clay coil all the way around it. It's going to hold just fine like this. So we'll go ahead and start with just the juice cap. And if that doesn't 100% work, then that is real close. I'm going to put this down here. Get a slightly smaller container for water. There we go. Now I'm good. So if this isn't enough, then I can add the coil later. All right. So when you're trimming, you want to work from point to flat. So the first thing I'm going to do is kind of establish where the foot needs to be. So this would be the outside diameter of my foot. And then I'm going to use the point, and I'm just going to go into that first line that I drew. And I'm going to get rid of that extra using the point. Then I can use the flat to get rid of the ridges left by the point. I might use the round part of this trimming tool near where the rim is, or the wall, because that fits that curve a little bit better. I can start thinking about this foot, at least the outside shape of it, which is going to be that it kind of tips in a little, so it sort of flares outward. And there's like a little bit of a ridge there. That will help catch any extra glaze that might want to drip. I always like to put a little bit of a ridge there if I can. Now I'm going to figure out where the inside of the foot is going to go, and I can start removing the excess clay from in here. Now, you really shouldn't have a ton of clay left. It's really hard to do a trimmed foot for a plate where it's a real trimmed foot, meaning that it's a 1/4 inch deep on the inside and you could glaze that flat part of the plate. Because honestly, even at a 1/4 inch, sometimes the center of the plate will slump a little bit in the firing and it'll stick anyway. So generally, you don't glaze the underside middle of your foot no matter what. If you're not going to glaze it, there's no point in making that hole a 1/4 inch deep and throwing with a full 1/2 inch thick bottom. So I usually recommend to people that they just don't bother with that. Just throw so you have a little bit of extra and you can trim like 1/8 of an inch foot into the bottom. The foot is structural. The foot acts a lot like the rim and it actually keeps the piece round. So it's good to have a foot. If you don't have a foot, sometimes the things are more likely to warp, especially if you haven't compressed well. If you do have a foot, it acts like a spine, like a collar, to kind of hold this into a round place. All right, I'm going to go ahead now and remove that juice cap, and just using the pressure of my finger and gravity to kind of keep this on the wheel head, I'm going to trim into the center. I'm not going super fast. Part of that's because I'm holding all this on by hand. My tools are sharp, so they should slice, and it shouldn't take much pressure to do the trimming. If your tools are dull, then you have to push a lot harder in order to cut the clay, and that's more what will throw it off than anything. So keep sharp tools, and your trimming will go much better. Little known thing about trimming tools, they sell most of them dull, especially all the cheaper ones. The more expensive black steel ones that you get from like Japan, those are generally sharpened when you buy them. But the more the American ones, like Kemper, that kind of thing, none of those are actually sharp when you buy them. Just using my fingertip to help burnish this a little bit. I can use a rubber rib as well, and I'm going to use one to kind of burnish this inside part. I like to burnish feet in some way because, especially for dinnerware, honestly, I mean, most ceramics is going to end up on a tabletop at some point. And if that's the case, you don't want your pieces damaging somebody's nice wooden tabletop. So I burnish my feet so that they're nice and smooth, and I'll often wet sand them when they come out of the kiln so that I am giving people a nice product that doesn't destroy their expensive furniture. Last thing you want is to hear from somebody that your dinnerware or your mugs wrecked their $15,000 tabletop. So I used the wooden rib first. This is a little on the stiff side, and the clay is fairly groggy, which means it has a lot of heavy particles in it. So that one actually caught and dragged a little bit, made a mark in there. So the rubber rib didn't really compress it as smooth as I'd like. So I'm going to switch to my steel metal rib, and then I can put more force on that thinner edge than I can with that thicker rubber edge. And that also let me come right in close here to where the foot, the inside line of the foot is. And I think that looks a little bit better. Okay. Now you're asking yourself, how do you possibly know how thick this is? Because I tested it before I put it on the wheel. And I just have a good sense of where that is and how much space I have. And I've done this a million times. So that's pretty much it. Compressed a little bit there in that bit of a bevel that I put in. And I'm going to go back to a rubber rib here because it'll kind of bend a bit. And it won't flatten all of my little fluting that I have on the wall of the plate. There we go. That's perfect. All right. Then I can turn this off. Always put your hand here before you turn your wheel off, just in case you push it the other way and you turn it on high. You need to grab it really quick. Then the last thing I would do is stamp my name on here. I make a name stamp. Actually, geez, I've had this thing for almost 30 years at this point, quite a long time. This is made out of old lead typesetting letters, and I just line them up backwards and then put tape around it so that I can stamp into the clay. I really like the lead letters because they're a nice sharp stamp, so I can stamp into things that are like late leather hard, and it still leaves a nice mark. All right, I can flip this over and double check this side. The inside of the plate is slightly domed from me doing the trimming. I might tap that back in a tiny bit. I can also tap center it from this direction if I want. Go ahead and do that just so you can see. And plates, if you're going to trim the inside of a plate, generally I recommend that you leave it connected to the bat that it was thrown on, and you don't wire it off right away, and you do your trimming from the top side before wiring it free, because then it's going to be perfectly centered. But otherwise, you can just tap center it. So all I'm doing here is I'm just burnishing this inside a little bit more, which is easier to do at this state of the clay, leather hard. And then I can get a nice fine edge where it meets the wall, which will be really nice for glazing. Again, that's harder to do when the clay is really soft, so I'll do it now while it's a little bit stiffer. And then I can even burnish this wall, and again come down to that same point. On the inside floor. I can use this a bit as a scraper as well to get those little extra bits up. Just keep wiping it clean as I clean them off. Now, if the little crumbly bits don't want to come off cleanly, I would recommend you simply leave them there until it's bone dry, and then brush them off with your fingertip. Or leave them there until it's bisque fired, and then knock them off with some wet dry sandpaper. Sometimes it's easier to clean these things when they're stiffer than to do it now. There we go. That looks good. Pretty happy with that. Nice and clean. Turn it off. Like I said, there's some little bit of tiny crumbs. I'd wet sand that off later, and then he's perfect. Okay, so that is a trimmed foot. The next one I want to show is a thrown foot. This plate, unlike the other one, was thrown with what I've been calling the easy method, which is that you put down a slab, and then you throw the collar, you throw the rim onto that slab. You can see these were two different types of clay, so it's easy to see how, I kind of had to blend them together. Because this bottom, this slab, is the correct thickness to start off with, I actually don't want to trim any of the flat off of it. All I'm going to do is trim the side angle into it, and then I'm going to throw a foot onto the bottom. So I'll go ahead and tap center this one, the same as the previous plate. Let's get the wheel turning a little bit and tap it until it's even. I can use my juice cap. And then, again, probably turn this up just a little bit. I'm going to use the point first. Actually, let's establish where is going to be where the foot goes. Say about like here. Then use the point. It kind of grabbed it a little bit there, dug in, and that pulled it off of being centered. So I'll just tap center it again, knock it back into place. Way too much caffeine today. We joke about this at work, like, I've had way too much coffee to tap center today. All right, now I'll get these off. If you have a lot of problems with trimming and the loop tools kind of catching, you can always use a Surform, a rasp, and that's not going to do any of that. And if I have clay where it's like just a real bear to try and trim it, that's what I'll use, is a Surform. And hear how groggy this clay is. It's kind of funny. All right, when I get closer to this rim here, I'm going to use the round end. so I can kind of blend into the curve of this rim. And this is your chance if you threw a rim that's a little on the thick side or anything. Now's when you can thin that down. There we go. Use my metal rib here as a scraper. This is something you do in woodworking, is using a flat piece of metal to actually cut with just like the edge of it. Same concept works in ceramics. All right, so I've got this all cleaned up. So I'll go ahead and do a little bit of compression and burnishing before I put that foot on. Now that's all done. There we go. And now I'm going to add a coil to this point here. I will need my scoring tool. I have. There we go. Score this really well. Add a little bit of water with a sponge, or you can use a brush. You just want to make sure you're adding enough water that when you score it, and when you go to score the piece of clay you're putting on here, that all is going to stay nice and soft where that connection is. Let me roll out a coil real quick. Did not have one ready. I'm going to roll part of this off camera. I've got a whole video on making coils, but I will mention that when I make a coil, I start by squeezing the coil closer to the diameter that I want it. And this is essentially wedging. This is essentially compressing this clay towards the coil. And then as I start rolling, that's going to compress it even more. Now I want to mention that I have a video on handle making where I show using a cross-section of wire that you basically bend the wire into a loop, and that is the cross-section of the handle material that you want, and it acts like an extruder. You can also use that same technique to create like a U shape, like a U with a flattened bottom, which works really, really well as a foot, or when you're doing thrown feet. Or I use it when I'm doing hand building, and I need some foot material to kind of start with, and I don't want to start with a rolled out coil. I want to get some of the work done already in advance. I'm just making sure that this is really well scored, and there's just enough moisture on here. There we go. Now I'm going to go ahead and put my coil on here. The coil clay is actually fairly wet, so I did not wet that scoring. I just made sure that the scoring was wet on the leather hard plate. Get those to overlap, and then I will cut through both of them at a 45-degree angle. That way I don't have to measure, but I get an accurate connection. Make sure you score your ends and add a little bit of water. This scoring tool is uniquely good at that. It acts as both a brush and a scratcher. It's called the Valentine, and I have a video on how you can make your own. All right, so first off, I'm just going to make sure that this is kind of connected, just stuck down okay, but not trying to shape it at this point. It's centered on here and it's stuck down. The next I'm going to do is go around, and I think of the best way, maybe you can see it best from here, and use my fingers to kind of press those edges down and push this into kind of like a V shape rather than just like a half round. And that's going to, I might even wiggle a little bit as I push. I just really want to make sure that this is well fastened. And so that's what this step is all about. It's getting this really, really well connected, and it will give this wet, mitered connection a little bit more time to even out in moisture level so that it will be less likely to want to kind of come apart on me when I go to start throwing this. Now, for thrown feet, for trimming this, I wouldn't put a coil down necessarily, but sometimes if I'm going to throw the foot, I will put a narrow coil down just so that I have a little bit holding it on here and I don't have to worry about my finger doing all the heavy lifting. I don't use coil or lumps to hold, I would much rather put a coil all the way around, or if not that, then some long sections of 1/4 inch coils to hold it in place. All right, there we go. All set. Bob's your uncle. Get my sponge. And the idea here is that you really don't want to use any more water than you absolutely have to. So I'm going to use my wooden tool to kind of help blend the clay and the inside seam, so kind of smooth that into place. Then I'm going to use my wooden tool on the outside and kind of blend that into place. That makes it so water is not going to get underneath that foot now. Get a little bit of water on here so my fingers don't stick. And this is exactly like centering the coil for pulling up your wall when you're wheel throwing. So I've got a demo on throwing cylinders, and I have one on throwing bowls. And for both of those, the way that I do my first pull is that after I've opened up the floor, I'm going to center the coil that's left. And that process of centering that coil is exactly what you do when you're throwing a foot onto the bottom of a piece. I've got a little bit of a ridge here that I'm going to trim that off. I ended up putting my foot a tiny little bit further in than I trimmed for. That's much better. There you go. So you can see, by making a tunnel, basically with my finger on the inside, thumb on the outside, and other finger with the sponge as a roof, by making that little tunnel and just holding it steady, it forces the clay into that shape, and now I've got a foot. If you don't want it to be soft like this is a more rounded foot, you can let this get to leather hard. I'd wrap the whole thing up. If you wrap it up, then the body will absorb moisture from the foot, and it won't dry ambiently, which is going to make it dry a little more evenly. Once this is the same consistency that the plate was when I put the foot on it, I can trim it as if it's just the clay that was originally here. So you can use it as just a blank. And if you're going to trim it, it doesn't even have to be even when you do it. It can be pretty rough, because once it's stiff, you're going to trim it so that it's perfect. So if you want a nice, sharply defined, trimmed foot, that would be how you would do it, even if you're throwing the material on here. Now, the advantage of this is that is a lot of clay. If I'd left that much clay so that I could trim down a true 1/4 inch, I mean, that's another like pound and a half of clay for a plate. And I have to center that clay, I have to control that clay, where this way, I didn't have to do that. And I end up with a great true foot on the bottom here without having to have manhandled all of that clay up to this point. And it looks like right here, that's a little thing that'll happen to you sometimes. If the clay is a little bit on the wet side, it got actually stuck to the bottom, so I'll just pull that away, and that just leaves me a teeny little bit that I have to clean up. No big deal. There we go. All clean. I would not put this on this foot onto anything that it can stick to, partly because this is wetter than the actual plate. I'm going to want to wrap this whole thing up in order to let it dry. So what I would do is actually put the plate on a piece of paper, scrap piece of paper, and then flip it onto that paper. I can go ahead and just pop this whole bat off of here. One of the best ways of moving and flipping a plate is to just put another board on the top, which I don't have, and just flip it like this onto a board. I'll just put it onto the paper and I can move it onto my board like that, and that's fine. But preferably when you're moving plates around, you just use 2 boards. So I'd have the plate upside down, paper, then a board, flip it, and it's going to keep the plate from torquing or getting warped from being moved around. Okay, so that was, and you can see how well that bat stayed on here. I had to pry it off, but it comes off really easily as well. And you can even reuse this clay. So, isn't that great? Thanks for joining me. Make sure you subscribe to my channel, and you'll get notified of any updates and new videos that are being posted. And I should be having some decorating videos coming out there pretty soon. So take care. See you soon. Bye.